Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jennifer Gray. I'm the Public Services Coordinator for FSCJ Library and Learning Commons, and welcome to Indigenous Jacksonville, 10,000 plus years of history. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I do want to just let you know a couple of things. First, you will notice that as you enter this room, you are force muted. We do that in deference to our speakers. You will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. If you have them during the presentation, drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll let you guys unmute and ask our speakers questions once they finish presenting. I think that's all my business for right now, so we're going to go ahead and get started this afternoon. When the history of Jacksonville gets told, it's frequently framed as starting in 1562 with French explorer Jean Ribault's first steps onto the banks of the St. Johns River. But the world Ribault stepped into was already populated with a thriving indigenous culture that had existed for more than 1,000 years and which formed part of a trade and diplomatic network that stretched into what is now the American Midwest. Here today to talk about that culture and the deep indigenous history of Northeast Florida are two guests from the University of North Florida, archaeologist Dr. Keith Ashley and historian Dr. Denise Bossy. Dr. Ashley, go ahead and take it away for us today.
Okay, thank you. I think the way we're going to set this up is I'm going to go for about 20 minutes and then Denise will go for 20 minutes and then we'll kind of open it up for any kind of questions or just some sort of interactions. So I'm going to set a clock here to keep me on pace. So before we start, I think Denise and I both really want to acknowledge that we work within areas that are really the unceded homelands of the Timucuas speaking Mocama. Later on, we see the Yamasees and the Guales move into our area as well. We also kind of want to further recognize the sovereignty of Florida Indians, primarily the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Mississippian tribe of Florida. So we really pay great respects and we take very seriously the work that we do within their lands. So we just want to make sure we acknowledge that and feel both really strongly about that. So what I'd like to start off talking about is the indigenous history. So I have this little graph here. And so basically, if we look at the history, the human history of Northeastern Florida or the broader Jacksonville area, it's probably about a 13,000, maybe 13,500 year history. And when you look at that, nearly 97% of that history is an indigenous history. And then if we want to just look at the 200 years of Jacksonville, that's probably about 1.5% of the history. So what we can see here is that there's an incredibly long and deep history of indigenous people. So Jacksonville really has this incredible, rich Native American history. And it's mostly an unwritten history, and it's one that I think is largely forgotten by many people. But I, as an archaeologist, would argue that that history is literally beneath their feet. And I believe that through archaeology, we can kind of cast a light on these kind of dark chapters within our history. And I think Denise, by doing her work, kind of reading across the grain and really teasing out an indigenous perspective from the text, that we can develop this really long indigenous history in which even after European contacts, we still center indigenous peoples. So one thing also, I guess the myth that I'm going to try to address is that there really wasn't much change, that they're kind of timeless people frozen in history. And that's not the case. If we take the way of life in the 1500s, in the Timucua speaking Mocama, and we understand that way of life, and then we move that 500 years earlier, that way of life won't fit what's going on here 1,000 years ago. Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. If we take that life at 1,000 years ago and we go back 500 more, that's not going to match then. When we go back 5 more, it's not going to match then. If we come back to 1562 and we move forward to 2022, it's not going to match then either. Indigenous people have always changed, so we shouldn't expect them to be the way they were now, the way they were when Europeans first arrived. They still retain their identity of who they are. And so they've changed. We've all changed. American culture changes. Western culture changes. So the indigenous cultures change. And it's nothing new. So I want to start looking back on this. When I talk to a lot of people, I think most people, when they imagine indigenous people in our area, usually what frames that image is either going to be these Debray engravings or maybe some of the French or Spanish narratives that kind of go along with that. All right. So that's really what people see. They see this little maybe 5-year window into the life of the Timucua Indians in the 1560s as their image of indigenous people in Northeastern Florida. First of all, that's just a passing glimpse. That 5-year window, if you think about it, with a 13,000 year history, that's just a blip. also that history is being filtered through Europeans. So we need to really keep that in mind, because I would argue that if you look below the village, that's more what we think a village or a community would look like. And in fact, Denise would say, actually, it's a town because it has a political center. It has a council house. It has other features that are there that makes it more than just a village. Corn, we know they're growing corn, but corn is a late addition to that. And we actually, through archaeology, radiocarbon dating, I can tell you that corn is not being grown in this area until 1450. So what I'd like to do is kind of take a real quick look at this 13,000 year history, but focusing on what happened 1,000 years ago. So really the first evidence we have of humans in the state of Florida is about 14,500 years ago, and that's in the panhandle of the state, in the Tallahassee area. In our area, the oldest evidence we have is what's up there. It's a Clovis projectile point, and we're looking at those dating to about 13,500 years ago. So at that point in time, we need to think about Florida was completely different than it is today. It was a lot drier, okay? There was less surface water. The state of Florida was probably twice the width it is now. So our area of the state was probably marginal to human occupation, because there really wasn't a lot of good accessible water nearby, but those that were there, they would find. So we see them kind of coming through this area probably 13,000 years ago. All right. Slowly, what we're going to see here is more and more traffic kind of coming through our area. So between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, we start to see throughout northeastern Florida, including our area, little archaeological sites that contain these projectile points of a distinct style, pieces of flakes for them making or working those projectile points. So what we have at this point in time are probably small kin groups who are kind of moving through this area as part of really large circuits that are probably covering much of the northern part of the state. All right, so these are really ephemeral kind of campsites. Then what happens about 5,000, 5,500 years ago, we're going to see something change from an environmental standpoint. The coastline begins to stabilize, and what we see is the development of the estuary. And this marks when indigenous people start to live in our area full time, 4 seasons of the year, every single year. So now we start to see permanent occupation of the St. Johns River near the mouth, of the barrier islands, of the coastline. So our area now becomes a full-time residence for indigenous people. And they begin to live off really the marsh. What we will see here from the archaeology that we do is that they are really incredible fishers. They collect shellfish. So they're kind of living off the land at this point in time. But one thing we need to really think about, we can't let their involvement with the environment really take over everything. There is much, much more to their way of life than just calories and acquiring food. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Just another thing that happens. 4,500 years ago, we see the first development of pottery. So what we have is some of the oldest pottery in all of North America emerges in our area, from just south of the St. Johns River up to the Savannah River in Georgia and slightly up those rivers. What's interesting, you might be thinking, well, wow, and pottery, archaeologists, they love their pottery. But there's a greater story behind this. I would argue the reason that pottery develops in this area has to do with politics. That what we see is that groups that are in the interior of Georgia are controlling soapstone, steatite, which is being used for either indirect cooking or for making bowls. So the groups here along the coast are kind of outside of that. They're marginal to those interaction networks. So they come up with this idea to do this, to bypass having to go through someone else. And so they come up with this technological innovation. What's interesting is those interior groups, they tried to resist a technological innovation because it's going to take them out of the center of this exchange network. So really, a lot of times when we talk about artifacts, there are these really deep, either religious, political, or other types of stories that are behind them that we're really trying to get to. Holding a 5,000-year-old piece of something is great. It really is. But we want to get to the people behind those, the processes, the things that are going on. What they do matters. Okay, who they're around matters. So these are the things we're really trying to get at. Another thing that happens here, about 3,500 years ago, we see the emergence along the coastline of these large architectural constructions, and they're called shell rings. Ring is kind of a misnomer. Usually they're incredibly large piles of oyster shells, other types of refuse, but they're actually engineered. And so usually they have some sort of curved element to them. They can be an enclosed ring. It can be more like a C shape or U shape. What's interesting, the largest one along the Atlantic coast is on Fort George Island, and its diameter would be roughly 190 meters, almost 2 football fields. That's a massive amount of labor. And what we're realizing in these locations are people from really disparate areas are coming together for gatherings. So there's a lot of interactions that are going on in which politics, religion, and other aspects of culture are involved in this. So this is a really important kind of time, and these are really great constructions that are going on. These are not just haphazard piles of shell. I mean, they are basically planned structures. Probably about 2,000 years ago, we start to see the emergence of above ground cemeteries where they start constructing mounds in which to inter their dead. These are accompanied by really incredible rituals and ceremonies that go on. Sometimes the materials that are kind of accompanying the deceased come from far-flung areas of the eastern United States. 1,500 years ago, we could talk about Swift Creek pottery. Once again, talking about pottery, but what this pottery talks to us about is actually, again, about long distance interactions, politics that's going on. Real quick, this design you see here, they carved this design into a wooden paddle, and then they press that paddle into the soft clay. And so we get that negative image. What we find out is when they carve those paddles, we can look for little signatures on those paddles to identify it. Say, okay, it's got a little signature there. That's paddle A. Well, we can find pottery that's been stamped with paddle A, and we can track what's going on. So we can track sites here in Jacksonville, multiple sites in Jacksonville that have that same paddle design. We're also finding it in Darien, which is up on the Altamaha River. And so what we're finding out are these pots are coming into these different areas. These are probably parts of gifting that are going on. These are parts of diplomatic relationships. This is not just simple trading. There's a lot more to it. All right. So now I just want to kind of jump ahead for the next 10 minutes and talk about this site that we've been working on here at the University of North Florida, really off and on for the last 22 years. I think if you would look across the state of Florida 1,000 years ago, the site that we're going to talk about, the Mill Cove Complex, that site and Mount Royal are probably two of the major indigenous communities in all of Florida at that time in terms of having these interactions with people a great distance away. So 1,000 years ago, we as archaeologists call this area the Mississippian World. Okay, so we're imposing that name on it. It consists of a lot of different polities that are going on. So it's not like one world with one leader. All right, there's a lot of interactions going on. And because of these interactions, at one gross level, a gloss, there's a lot of similarity. But when you scratch that surface, there's incredible diversity among them. What we're going to see is the site that I'm talking about in the indigenous people of northeastern Florida, who are represented here by the Mill Cove Complex, are going to be involved in these far-flung interactions. So I want you to keep in mind this place right here called Cahokia. This is right outside of St. Louis, Missouri. In fact, it straddled the Mississippi River on the St. Louis, Missouri side and the East St. Louis, Illinois side. And what we're going to see are going to be connections between the indigenous people here and within those areas. So this Mississippian world, this is kind of the high water mark in terms of socio-political complexity among indigenous people of the southeastern United States. At this time, we're going to have all these polities, these kind of political centers really rise throughout the southeastern United States. We're going to see these interaction networks that it's going to just bring stuff all over the place. So now if we come here and look at where we are here in Jacksonville, Florida, okay, we're trying to, at University of North Florida, trying to kind of reconstruct the social landscape. Where were people living? Where were they going 1,000 years ago? And so what we have are with these blue dots, these we think are these are communities that are existing. And the red dots represent this huge community called Mill Cove. So our goal has been not just to excavate at this the best site here, the center, Mill Cove, but really to try to look at all the sites that are being occupied so we can really get this comprehensive understanding of what's going on. So our approach is multi-scalar. We want to understand it within these individual communities. Then we want to open the scale up more. How are these communities interacting with one another? Then open it up even more. And how are this area interacting with people within that broader world? That broader world which was stretched from where we are to the southern tip of Florida, where we are up to the Great Lakes and where we are, over into the Carolinas. So it's this really large world. Okay, it's not a global world at this time, but they are interacting with people who have vastly different histories. So European contact is not the first time they encountered people at great distances away. Sure, it's going to be writ large with the Europeans, but they're interacting over these great broad areas. So in the 1890s, an individual started excavating mounds in our area. We don't do that anymore. We have more respect for indigenous people, so we really aren't looking at the mounds. But we have this material from what he did in the 1890s. And what we can see here is that stuff from far-flung areas are coming in. Galena, okay, which is like a lead ore, it's coming from the Ozark Mountains, Missouri, Arkansas. Mica is coming from the Appalachian Mountains, quartz from the Appalachian Mountains, steatite from the Georgia area. So these things are coming into this area. And when they come into this area and they're acquired by the indigenous people in our area, they're not going to use these things as utilitarian items. They're not going to use these celts for hammering. These become kind of pieces of places. Okay, they start to carry on cosmological connotations and they become really important to them. They have the potential to become animated. So indigenous people, they live in this very fluid world in which both human beings and non-human beings both exist. So he also found pieces of copper. Again, this is copper that's indigenous constructed copper artifacts. This is not anything related to Europeans. From these plates to these biconical ear spools, I think students today would call them ear gauges. All right. We have long-nosed god mask. So I don't know if you can see it. This is a reconstructed one. All right, it's made out of copper. Copper is coming from the Great Lakes. So it has these really goggle-looking eyes, a shield face, and it has a story to it. The Ho-Chunk who are in that area have a story about Redhorn, okay? Morning Star, who has this great narrative and a big part of their origin stories. That story probably doesn't resonate here with them, but they probably take aspects of that and tweak it to fit their own stories. So they incorporate these in. So we start to see these in here. What is interesting about them is that there's only been 7 pairs found in copper in all of North America. They're being made at Cahokia in that Missouri, Illinois area, but a bunch of fisher folks and shellfish collectors in Jacksonville, Florida are going to acquire them, which is pretty remarkable. There's a big story with that. So we've been working off and on to look at this. And this story that I'm telling you, and these interaction networks and everything that's going on here at 1000 AD, this is not going on when Europeans arrived in 1500. So this is something that's really, really different. So don't try to take these specifics of this historical circumstance and kind of try to apply them to the 1500s, because it really doesn't work. Things have happened in the intervening years. All right, so we have great stuff. We have pottery and we have special pottery. So we look at these distributions and we realize that this pottery down here in the lower right is more like I guess we could say a china, a fineware. So we're seeing this in restricted areas. So we're starting to realize, hey, something special is going on in those areas. We just found this a couple months ago. And this is a bird adorno. So it would have been sat on the top of a pot and it is broken off. So we're getting really these great ceramics. We're looking at distribution, different things that are happening. So we're starting to find areas that are everyday domestic areas where they're living, where their houses were, but we're also getting areas that are probably high profile ritual and feasting areas. We're getting great artifacts from, these are animal bones. One's a hairpin, but you can see this kind of ladder design on it. In this one here, this lenticular looks kind of like a bird head. You can still see the iron oxide and the ochre that's in it. We're getting probably parts of rattles. We're getting drilled shark's teeth. So we're starting to get things that are more ornamentations. So we're getting everyday things, we're getting kind of special things, but they're kind of spatially separated, and that's helping us to really understand what's going on within this community. We're getting lots of things that are made of shell, lots of beads. So what is common here, whelk shells, would have been kind of rare within the interior. So this is something some of those interior groups would have wanted from our area. This is a great piece here. We don't know what it means, but some people have said, hey, there is a broader cosmological story among Southeastern Indians in which there's 3 worlds. There's a story about 4 cosmic chords. So we wonder, it's kind of thought-provoking. Could this maybe represent something like that? that it's more than just this little image, that it actually has really strong origin story or cosmological narrative properties to it. It's a manifestation of that. We have small little true arrowheads. The bow and arrow has been innovated by now. We're getting pieces of copper. We have 2 Cahokia points. So we have lots of things that are really coming into our area from a great distance away. We're getting lots of bone from what they're eating. So we're getting an idea, hey, this is what they're eating on an everyday basis. And then we have areas where the quantity is so incredible that these have to be areas of feasting. So a lot of what they're eating are going to be things we can catch today. Catfish and mullet and redfish and sea trout and sheep's head, all those types of things. We're getting lots of different turtles. We're getting a little bit of alligator. We're getting mammal. In this one area, we're getting more deer than we usually get. We usually get deer, but not in the quantity we're getting here. Also within this one area, we're getting shark, we're getting fox, we're getting bear, we're getting panther, we're getting otter. We just got a beaver tooth. So we're getting all these incredible things that are probably coming from outside of this area, or things that really aren't eaten on a regular basis. All right. So what we have here are these great things that are coming from a great distance away. So if you can look at this map, you can see where Cahokia is, and a lot of things that originate in Cahokia that are really special, probably highly prized, not just little trinkets. They usually fall just along the Mississippi River or off some of the major tributaries. But look over here in northeastern Florida, all over there by itself, at the site that we're working on, indigenous people in northeastern Florida 1,000 years ago, we have the long-nosed god mask. The left is the way it exists today in the National Museum of the American Indian. To the right is a drawing of it when it first came out in the 1890s, came out of the ground. We're getting those bioconical ear spools, which were made at Cahokia. They've only been found also at Spiro, which is in Oklahoma. We have a hoe, which is made out of Burlington shirt. So this would have been an agricultural product that was probably used on an everyday basis within Cahokia, but here it takes on some sort of special connotations. And so we have that here. We also have the points. So right now there have been 3 Cahokia points found in Florida, Georgia, Alabama. Okay. 2 of them are in the yard that we're working on here in northeastern Florida. The 3rd one is at Mount Royal, which is just up the St. Johns River. We think we might have part of a 4th one as well. So what we have are these things that are coming a great distance away. So while some of these things have been known for a long time, everyone used to think, well, the groups at Cahokia traded with another group, who traded with another group, who traded with another group, who traded with another group, and eventually it makes it here to northeastern Florida, which means those on the 2 ends, Cahokia and northeastern Florida, never were in contact. We don't think that's the case at all. There should be some sort of what we call a fall-off curve. We think that this is direct contacts. All right, so we think that these are parts of pilgrimages. This is diplomatic relationships. This is gifting that's going on. This is not, I'm going to give you 25 shells and you're going to give me a piece of copper. There's a lot more to these. Are relationships that are going on that are deeply embedded in religious practices, spiritual diplomacy, as Denise would call it. All these great things that are going on, that this is not just a simple group of people living along the tidal creeks fishing. Okay, their subsistence and everyday stuff is coming from the local area, but really what makes them and part of their social reproduction is for them to be able to sustain linkages over great spans. And not only is it great distance, that's what I'm focusing on here, the things they're getting from great distances away, but they're also acquiring things from deep time. That we also have things that are thousands of years older that they have acquired and they use them. So really their connections are not only across great space, but in terms of deep time. So these things become citations or historical reference for their ancestors, for their origin stories. So they become physical, tangible things that they can capture and touch upon to be able to reach ancestors, to reach the past, to see their presence, here today. So I think I'm kind of where I want to be in the time. So while my interest and my concern is with the deep past here in northeastern Florida, we need to avoid kind of relegating the importance and the presence of indigenous people just to the deep past, that they're here today. They are an amazing story of resistance, resiliency, survivance. So with that said, I'm going to move on to Denise to look at something a little more recent in time.
So I want to thank everybody for coming today. And I want to back up a little bit and tell you part of why Keith and I are appearing as this, I'm going to call us a dynamic duo. And that is because we are writing a book. And it's a public-facing book on the local Indigenous history of Northeast Florida. It starts, as you could tell from Keith's talk, over 13,000 years ago. And it goes in some ways to the present, with a lot of meaningful time in my parts on sort of French and Spanish colonizers and the movement of other indigenous people, the Yamasees and Guales, into Northeast Florida. And so we're really looking for feedback from you today, and that's something I really want to invite. And questions. What do you want to know about the Indigenous history of Northeast Florida? We can't cover everything in 45 minutes or even an hour. And so we want to leave a lot of space for that too. So that's why we're going to end hopefully with enough time for some questions. Today, I'm going to zero in on what I've been working on of late, right? And so in some ways, I'm starting the book, my part of the book, in the middle of the book, and that's where it should be, right? The arrival of the French to Northeast Florida is not a sort of start of Indigenous history in our region. It occurs, in fact, not even in the middle, but sort of towards the end, as you could tell with Keith's timeline. But I shouldn't say end, because there really is no end to local Indigenous history. There's a continuity. There's change, adaptation, outmigration, reinvention. But I'm going to zero in on what the Mocama, or the Timucua-speaking Mocamas of our region, made of the French, who were here for less than 2 years and didn't have a lasting impact really on their society. And so we're going to think through together a lot of the ways in which we can both read documents in a different way and the different story that this offers us. Now, part of the problem that Keith and I confront is that Indigenous history locally is really told through myths. There are a lot of myths and legends. Legends are, very loosely based in some historical facts, but then are given more weight than what actually happened, right? So they're not realistic. So part of what Keith and I try to really ardently do, really earnestly do, is unpack these myths to reveal not only a much deeper, broader, more complex local Indigenous history, but one that doesn't just privilege one voice. So the Fort Caroline story, if you don't know it, in its legendary state, right, the legend of the French in Fort Caroline is that in 1562, the French came through the region. They were actually here for just 2 days, planted a column to claim sovereignty in the area, to claim the territory that was actually Sacherewa's as their own, leave the region, and then come back in 1564, are here for less than 2 years, are really friendly with Indigenous people. Things start to decline a bit, but really what happens is the Spanish come in and slaughter them. And this is the story of Fort Caroline. And this is why in the 1950s, it was created as a national memorial to the French. Now, I should couch this in terms of pointing to the 1950s, right? The senator who is responsible for really launching what has become the Timucuas Preserve, which is an incredible space, was very interested in memorializing the French, both for their religious Huguenot status as Protestants in a largely Catholic world, and looking at the way in which they tried to establish what he called like this freedom, religious freedom space. But also he was very interested in creating a narrative of colonial sort of white success to rival the Puritans in New England. So this is the 1950s, right? Race is really constructed very differently then. So this is the legend of both Fort Caroline and the French, and also some context about why we're stuck in some ways with this story. And so now I'm going to unpack all of that, and I'm going to redo it. And I'm going to tell you a fuller story, both from French perspectives, but also I'm going to insert for the first time into this narrative Timucua perspectives, which are largely erased. When you go onto like the Fort Caroline Wikipedia site, you don't see a lot about the Timucuas. When you talk to folks about the Fort Caroline legend, when you see it in a textbook, especially a children's textbook, you don't see a lot about the Timucuas. But this was their space. And so here's a map that is the beginning of a reconstruction of their space. And it gives you a sense of where the French were, which is, probably somewhere around here. We don't know where exactly. But they're in the middle and also on the edge of a very big, dynamic, powerful confederation of Timucua-speaking Mocamas. They don't call themselves Mocamas, but that's the dialect that they speak. And their confederation, their confederacy largely corresponds to that language group. So I'm going to use the term Mocamas for them. They speak Timucua, which is a large language group that encompasses at least 11 different dialects and is actually being reconstructed right now by a linguist. And so if you're interested in the language and what's happening with that, I can tell you more about that in the question and answer period. So the French are in the middle of Mocama territory and also on the edge of it because they're also on the coastal edge. And they are purposefully looking for indigenous people. The French model themselves to a large extent on the Spanish. The Spanish in the 16th century have already been wildly successful. They have seemingly easily, which is not true, but that's sort of the story that the Spanish and French are telling themselves, easily conquered two very powerful, very rich indigenous polities in Mexico and Peru. And this has made the Spanish wildly rich because they are stealing indigenous wealth and they are enslaving indigenous people. And this is the basis of their wealth. When the French come into the region, the first time in 1562, Captain Ribaud comes and he has literally fantasies of Spanish legends dancing in his head. He both knows about these Spanish successes and then he also knows about Spanish legends of finding cities of gold, for example. And that's what he's looking for. And when he comes into our region in 1562, he very much sizes up what's here. And he believes he sees silver, gold, copper, and he does see those. They're from Spanish wrecks for the most part, Spanish shipwrecks being traded up for indigenous networks into our region. He also thinks the local Timucuas would make good slaves. He says this very overtly. And he also thinks that those slaves and also free Timucuas would readily provide lots of food for the French. So it's an ideal place to settle according to Spanish and now also French guidelines. What he doesn't really understand is the power of the Timucuas. They look rich, they look powerful, but he believes that the French can easily subdue them. So they plant a column here, and they do that, the French, to sort of create a marker along the seacoast that they can easily see so they can come back. The Timucuas interpret that marker very differently. They don't interpret it as French claiming some of their land. Instead, they interpret that marker as a gift, a sign that the French acknowledge their power and their sovereignty, their right to this territory, but most of all, French interest in exploring the beginnings of a diplomatic relationship. And from Keith, you really got a sense that these are very diplomatically savvy people who have a very deep, long history of politics, religion, and territoriality. So they're bringing all of this to bear. All of this shapes how they understand their relationship with the French. So that is 1562, 2 days that the French are here. And they do very limited interactions, and they really don't speak one another's languages. So it's a lot of sign language attempts. When they come back in 1564, the French enter once again Saturiwa, indigenous territory, Mocama space, right? Part of this larger Mocama confederacy. So I'm going to spend a few moments thinking about how the French understand this world, but especially what the Mocama world looks like. And here I want to talk a little bit about documents. So all of the documents that I'm using are French. There are no Timucua documents from this period. So it's really interesting to read them together as I have. What you find are sort of two voices in the French document. You find one voice that I call an advertising slogan, where the French repeatedly say, we're friends with indigenous people, they're really excited that we're here, they're sad we're leaving, we're friends with them. If you were to just cross out all of that French advertising slogan, you would find a really different narrative is left. And those slogans are just sort of, it's funny, periodically put in, like, oh, it's time to, repeat that slogan again. And that slogan is intended not for indigenous people, it's intended for other French people and other Europeans for two reasons. One is to write back to France and sort of say, look, it's going really well and we should keep investing in this project, right? I think of it like grant writing. I'm a really good grant writer because they tell the grant folks what they want to hear. I use their language, the language of success. And for the French, friendship is really instrumental. Indigenous friendship is really instrumental to success, they really believe. The other audience are other Europeans who are reading these French documents, right? And so the French are saying, we're nicer colonizers than you are. So let's take that French advertising slogan out. And what we're left with is, in fact, a really complicated narrative where the French repeatedly show what they're doing and what they intend to do, where they largely talk about coming to find gold and silver, not religious freedom, where they largely talk about Indigenous people as potential slaves, and in fact do enslave some Indigenous people actively, even in 1562, where they also talk about Indigenous territoriality and recognizing that they are in what we're calling Mocama space. So this is a map from the late 17th century based on all of these accounts that I've been writing. So it shows us like the mental imagination, the kind of cartoon-like mental imagination. And what I want you to notice is how tiny the French settlement is. And yet this is a profoundly populated space. And the French need it to be that, and it is that, because they are reliant on Indigenous people to understand what's available. And they also believe in enslaving Indigenous people to make what's available more readily available. So they're hoping for gold mines, silver mines, copper mines, they're hoping for turquoise, they're hoping for pearls, and they're not planning to do the labor themselves of extracting that mineral wealth. They're expecting Indigenous people to do it, as the Spanish have been doing in Mexico and Peru. So the French are a tiny outpost in an Indigenous world that they not only recognize, but need to be there. Every time you read a French account of them establishing Fort Caroline in this area, they begin by acknowledging that it is Saturiwa's territory. And Saturiwa is the name of both a polity, a political town grouping, and also the name of the leader of that polity. It was really common for Indigenous leaders to take on the name of the community they were governing. So here's one such quote, but there are many, many others. And this is from Jacques Lemoyne, who supposedly gave, the drawings that Debray later made engravings from, although we know those engravings are highly inaccurate. But sadly, the originals of his paintings do not survive. But he was here. He was here at Fort Caroline, and the intention was that he was going to make maps and also draw a lot of what he saw. So he says, some chiefdoms approached our captain and gave him to understand that they were subjects of a certain powerful chief named Saturiwa, whose territory we were in, whose residence was near to us, and who could put into the field so many thousand men. So I want you to linger with that, so many thousand men. So two things to take away. The French readily acknowledge that they are in Saturiwa territory, that they've planted this column in 1562, but it does not make the land theirs. They are here only because Saturiwa, who can put into the field so many thousand men, is allowing the French to be here. So why would Saturiwa do this? He is very interested in the possibility of a military alliance with the French. The French enter a region in the midst of its own history, a very long, deep, profound, complex history. In this case, that history has a number of different really important facets that are relevant to this discussion. One is that Saturiwa is at the head of a very large, very peaceful confederacy held together through kinship ties, diplomatic ties, religious ties, that probably includes about 30 different town groupings. So it's large and peaceful. The other part of this is that he's also engaged in protecting that society, and so are many other leaders with him. He doesn't act alone, but the French often talk about him alone because that's how they think of leadership. He's also engaged in protecting that sort of sovereignty, that control, that power by playing off of other outside confederacies that also exist, most notably one called Utina, headed by a man named Utina, whose members are called the Thimagonas. And they are a little bit more powerful, goes the story, and they also have gold and silver readily accessible, goes the story. So it's a society really divided between peace and war, and very differently organized than the French society at the time. So Saturiwa thinks he can enfold the French. They will become, under his power, really powerful military allies, and that's his reason for allowing them to stay here. And this is an image that shows you just the coastline, sort of the expanse that we think of as Mocama, and then to the north, Guales. So I just want to talk a little bit about how that relationship goes and how quickly it falls apart. And this is debunking both French myths of success and also the myths of their failure. So I'm just going to talk for a couple of more minutes. So I essentially think of this as a four-part play. There are four parts to the play, which is the relationship between the Timucua-speaking Mocamas, represented in French minds by Saturiwa, and the French over the course of their time here. The first act is the French arrive, and for about 2 months, engage in a lot of diplomacy and are allowed to sit in and establish a fort in what is Saturiwa territory. And they readily acknowledge that that's what's happening, that they are in someone else's territory and that they are allies. And Satyriwa makes it clear that the terms of their alliance are military. You will assist me in waging war against my enemies. That is the foundation. Almost within weeks, the French begin to violate that alliance because they hear that Utina has greater access to gold and silver. And they're being played by Utina, right? Who very quickly realizes that this is what the French want and also would like a military alliance with the French. And the French immediately begin lying to Satyriwa. They are exploring Utina. They will have French settlers living in Utina the entire time, and they lie to Satyriwa, who knows they're lying to them. In the second episode, which is basically from so they're here a couple of months, by August to about the next May, things really begin to fall apart. They're sort of doomed from the beginning, but really begin to fall apart. It's very clear the French don't intend to uphold their alliance with Satyriwa. They actually begin to think about moving. They want to go closer to the Appalachian Mountains, which are really featured very prominently in that French map. They believe that that is the source of gold, silver, copper, and other things. So they're already planning to move and to leave this area, and they're motivated very much by gold. During this period, Satyriwa persistently tries to get the French to honor the terms of their military alliance, to go to war with him and the other leaders under his authority. That is the term of the alliance, and the French persistently lie and maneuver to try to get out of it. In the third phase, by about January, the Mocamas and Timucuas, who are the Utina native people, are already beginning to withdraw all of their assistance to the French. So things are really falling apart, especially food. And the French begin to experience a famine. And the Mocamas in our region are essentially trying to drive them out by withdrawing all food assistance, expecting them to leave. The French also begin to demolish their fort. They begin to deconstruct it because they know that they can't stay here. They begin to think about maybe going to Santa Elena in present-day South Carolina, where they believe they have potential for indigenous alliances. In the final phase, phase 4, in late August, the French have now decided to leave. They can't possibly sustain their alliances here. They've actually destroyed their own alliances with local Timucuas because as they've been starving, they've also unleashed incredible violence against indigenous people and have decided to not even try diplomacy anymore. This is the moment when two things happen. The Spanish arrive under Pedro Menendez, who will establish St. Augustine, and a big fleet of French arrive to assist the French. They are delayed. They were supposed to be there a long time ago. This is part of why they've been starving. But when the French arrive, the French kind of relief fleet, and when the Spanish arrive, Laudonnière, who is the head of this French settlement at Fort Caroline, says to Captain Ribot, who's the head of the French relief, "We can't stay here. We've destroyed our indigenous relationships. There is no way we will survive here." And so the story of French failure, that the Spanish are the ones who come in and sort of deal that final death knell blow, is really false. The French readily acknowledge that they've already done that themselves by destroying their relationships with indigenous people. So again, all of this is very easy to uncover. You simply read the French documents themselves. You let them tell you what's going on. You don't pay attention to the advertising slogans. And you also use that long perspective that Keith has been giving us of what the Mocama world looked like. You bring that up, to 1500 or so, but that's easy to do through both the archaeology and also by reading the French documents for clues into indigenous behavior, the ceremonies that are important to them, the diplomacy that's important to them. All of that is captured in some sense by the French documents when read in conjunction with this deep archaeology. So that's what I'm working on right now. I'd be really happy to talk more about that. I'm going to be doing many other periods of Mocama history too, but that one's really relevant to local history. I should say that we're doing this also in some sense in partnership with the National Park. They're very open to more meaningfully including and centering Mocama and greater and deeper indigenous history. They're fantastic partners to work with. They've been saddled to a small extent or a large extent with this colonial triumphalist narrative that I provided at the beginning, but they're really eager to see history as multi-perspectival, right? To incorporate Mocama perspectives and not just French and Spanish ones. And so that's what we're working towards. So really happy to take any questions. As you're starting to think of them, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm also going to share that in addition to our book, we are launching this summer a digital humanities site that will include everything that Keith and I have been talking about. We'll probably start with the Fort Caroline narrative because that's what I'm currently working on with a graduate student. And you'll be able to do an Indigenous tour of Fort Caroline on your phone. You'll be able to take your phone and to sort of see the French narrative and then to see the Mocama narrative as well. So questions, comments, thoughts, things that we didn't include, things that we did include, things that were confusing because we were like pushing it all into such a short time.
Yes.
We would really welcome that.
Yes, ma'am. Question. My question is, who y'all think is the indigenous people of today? Because Christopher Columbus, when Christopher Columbus came to America, he saw the indigenous people, right? And they stole this land. They killed the land. They killed the people, the indigenous people, in cold blood, then turned around and made them pay for their land back.
I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question. So Columbus doesn't come to Florida, obviously. He's in the Caribbean. He initiates a large scale, colonization program by the Spanish. That really varies from place to place. We work against narratives of extinction. So Mocamas in our region were not made extinct by European colonization. Many moved away, especially during the so-called mission period, where we see a lot of Franciscans moving into the region. But there are still folks today who claim the Mocamas and other Florida Indians as descendants, as ancestors, including the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe of Florida. And yes, you're right that there's incredible theft of indigenous lands and also indigenous wealth, which is partly land, but partly other forms of wealth. And that is the long history that goes well into the 19th and 20th and even the present day, that part of our nation's founding and also expansion is through indigenous theft, right? The theft of lands and other resources. And that's something that indigenous people today still very actively battle. So hopefully that answers the question. Anybody else? I see one in the chat, for example, from Susan, if she wants to ask her question.
I have a question. Can you hear me? Okay. If the French were prepared to leave, and why is it in the documents why Ribault decided to go ahead and preemptively strike the Spanish in St. Augustine instead of being like, hey, everyone, let's get on the boats and get out of here because we've kind of ruined this spot?
That's an excellent question. So Ribault has been here for 2 days before he comes back as a relief mission, 2 days. And during those 2 days in 1562, he convinces himself that this is a great place to colonize. There are other places that he also thinks are great to colonize. And Laudonnière has been the one in charge. Ribault has been in England and ultimately incarcerated in the Tower of London. Laudonnière has been here devastating indigenous relationships himself, relationships with his own men, and in turn watching that devastation and its effect. And he has realized there's no way we can stay. And when Ribault arrives, he's the superior officer. And Laudonnière says to him, like, we just have to get out of here. And Ribault says, absolutely not. Like, we're fighting for this space. And he immediately sets off to engage the Spanish and is ultimately killed by the Spanish. So there's not a lot of strategy time. And he is not persuaded, for example, when Laudonnière warns him about hurricane season. He's a superior officer. He really has very little knowledge of and very little connection to this region. He's been here 2 days. And that was several years before, and a lot has happened in his life since. So in some senses, it's simply not listening to Laudonnière, who also has lost a lot of his men's faith. So there's reason to not listen to Laudonnière in one sense, but that's really why it's internal leadership issues. But they couldn't have stayed. There was no way for them to stay. They've devastated those relationships. So even say the Spanish don't arrive, this is counterfactual. Say the Spanish don't arrive, say the Spanish don't succeed, the French are not staying here. There's no way to repair the relationships. They have so devastated them. They're not going to be here.
Thank you.
Susan, I think you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes. Will you describe the artifacts that have been found and how they relate to their lifestyle?
Well, we found a lot of artifacts from a lot of different time periods. So it depends. Some artifacts that we find are part of their everyday subsistence, their everyday living. Other artifacts we find are more ritual or ceremonial related. So we see a great variety of artifacts. So is there any kind of a specific question about artifacts? I mean, a specific type of artifact?
Well, yes, artery, weapons.
Okay, we do see small stone points that could be used for hunting. They could possibly be used for some of the raiding that we hear about later in times. We get ornaments. We lack stone in this area. So the stone for us is really deep, and so they don't have access to it. So stone has to be brought in from other areas, but we do get small stone points. They're probably also taking wood and just having fire hardened wood. They're using various types of teeth to point for points. They're using antler for various types of activities. So they're utilizing a lot of the bones from the animals.
Pottery?
Pottery, we get lots of pottery. Pottery
What colors would it be?
colors. Well, pretty much all the pottery, they don't have kilns, so all their pottery is pit fired. So a lot of times they're going to have differential coloring. Sometimes it could be a little bit orange, and it's orange because it's well fired and there's iron in the clays. Other times it's kind of black. Other times it's mottled because they can't control the oxygen and the temperature. We get various kinds of decorations, from stamping that I talked about earlier, to incising, to pinching, to all different types. And a lot of times decorations can undergo kind of fluorescence during certain periods. Then we can date that time period and use those as markers for different times.
Will there be pictures of them in your book?
Pictures of them,
Yes, in your book.
we may have some here and there.
Yes. But just as
Yes.
Keith showed today,
Thank you.
he showed lots of slides of artifacts and talked a lot about their significance. So Desiree asks just a great question. What are the big takeaways? Because it can be very overwhelming, right? You think you know Jacksonville history, or you think, I teach a lot in the Native South. I have students come in and they think they know Southern history, and suddenly I'm presenting them with what seems like, a foreign international studies type course. So this is a really important question. What are the big takeaways from today? And so I'll let Keith talk about kind of deep history. That's going to be one of, the big takeaways. The big takeaway from sort of my component of the book, which really looks from contact to the present, is that Indigenous people had a lot of power, that the story in our region is not one of first French colonization and then Spanish colonization, but rather it's a persistent Indigenous presence, not just presence, but political presence. I think all too often students, I'm doing a lot of consulting with a fourth grade textbook right now. All too often students are taught to think of Indigenous people just through culture, and I'm talking about them through political lens. They are powerful. They own this territory. Well into the 1680s, into the early 18th century, local Mocama leaders repeatedly tell the Spanish, this is our land. This is our territory. It's not yours, it's ours. So even after over a century of intensive colonization of the region, Indigenous people in our space say, this is our land. So I would say that's a really big takeaway. This is Indigenous land. And they're very aware of that. They're strong, powerful, political, savvy people. And that lasts for a very long time. The other thing I would have you take away is they don't go extinct. That's paleontological language. That's something we apply to dinosaurs. They move, they join other groups, they don't go extinct. And disease is not the main reason that they're not here anymore. It's intentional, active colonial violence. And colonization by the French and colonization by the Spanish is intentionally incredibly violent. They intend to enslave Indigenous people. They intend to steal their land and their wealth. This is intentional violence. When we talk about disease, it's a way to not talk about that intentionality. And yet, Indigenous communities survive. They suffer, but they're also resilient. And so here I'll let Keith talk about deep history.
I guess, yeah, to me, one of the big takeaways is twofold. One, change was constant. They were constantly changing over time. So it wasn't like they were just all of a sudden this kind of low, stagnant kind of thing, or just slight change over long periods of time. Then all of a sudden Europeans arrive, and that's when the change happens. That's not the case. We see change happening throughout it. All right, so change is not always slow and gradual. It can be marked and it can happen quickly. All right, so I think that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is they're not, I think a lot of times people want to tell me or want to think, hey, they're just living here by the salt marshes, they're fishing, they're doing their daily thing, and that's it. They're involved in these interaction networks that really extend over great areas. So we see all these great social networks that are happening at multiple scales. Sometimes they're maybe more localized, other times they're local and kind of regional. Then at other points in times, they can be over an incredibly large area. They can be expansive, covering the entire eastern US. And then those things can break down and things change a little bit, and then they can pick up again. So these contacts and long distance interactions throughout time wax and wane. It's not this kind of consistent gradual buildup, that there are a lot of things that happen. Like once it breaks down about 1200, what we start seeing before European contact is a lot more residential mobility. People are moving around a lot. Then they basically start to kind of become more sedentary again, and that's when we see the development of what becomes known as kind of the Mokama of the document. So I would say that change is always happening, and that basically they're involved in all these social networks that extend well beyond the salt marshes and the tidal flats.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Let me get to those and then we'll cycle back to the raised hand if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm going to collapse two of the questions together, if that's all right. So, and I haven't forgotten about you, Dana. We'll come back to the shell ring site. But Beryl and Tim, Beryl and Susan ask a related question. So Beryl asks if we're working with Indigenous communities. We are just starting to partner. We're just starting to write the book. So this is the moment when you reach out to Indigenous representatives, not when you're done with the book, when you're just starting it, as you say, to conceptualize it. So we were actually down in Miami last week, but the day before we went a day early to meet with the Seminoles for a long time with researchers and archivists there. And they're very aware of the project and its importance. And they emphasize the need not to talk about Indigenous people as extinct because they claim Florida Indians as among their ancestors. So this answers also Susan's question. They claim Timucuas, Appalachians, Guales, Yamasees, Calusas, they actually have a Calusa dance as among their ancestors. So that's really important to know. I don't know if Keith wants to add anything to that, but then that gets sort of those two questions.
But one thing quickly that both of us have encountered this in looking at the documents is that when the Spanish attempt at missionization, the Spanish are constantly worried about the Mokama and other Timucua and other coastal groups fleeing the area, that they're moving to these areas. They have these social networks, they know relatives, they have friends, they have other communities. They're going to these areas to get away from, and as Denise puts it, they're strategically doing this. They're not just running wildly into the woods. They're going to places to basically get out of direct contact with the Spanish. And from there, they're probably moving in, and eventually, I feel fairly confident, even though we don't have the documentation for this, is they become part of what's known today as the Seminoles. And that's one thing we're really trying to look for, good, hard, concrete evidence of this.
So Dana asked about progress on, I'm not sure what opening the shell ring site means, but opening the shell ring site.
I would think that's in relationship to the Grand Shell Ring, which is on Big Talbot Island. What's interesting about that is all the shell rings that I kind of mentioned, all the shell rings we know about date to about 3,500 years ago. That shell ring actually only dates to 1,000 years ago. So that shell ring, I believe that they're actually commemorating the past, that they're familiar looking across the landscape between what is natural and what is human made, and they're actually reconstructing one 2,000 years later in time. But in terms of them opening up, I think everything was a go for it, and then the pandemic hit, and the state park lost the money because of everything that went on. So they're in the process of trying to get money to open it to the public.
Okay, I have one more question. I'm sorry, but I have a lot of questions, and this one's kind of complex, and so it might take me a second to even formulate what I'm trying to ask. But the standard history, and I teach history of Florida, so the standard history is sort of that the true breaking point in Florida for the Timucua is James Moore and his attack on the mission system and the following attacks. and how that is sort of seen and viewed as a genocide on Indigenous people in North Florida. And so I see how what you guys are saying now is like, well, people had already left the area, and even those who were killed in those attacks or sold into slavery during those attacks, we still had other people who persisted. I'm guessing from what you're saying, went to live amongst the Creek and other groups in Georgia and Alabama. And I feel like that hasn't really been the standard way that the story has been told. And I'm wondering also, because for a long time, when it was convenient for the US government to lump Indigenous people together, they're like, oh, they're all Indians. And so there was this push when we were trying to, study history, looking at the complexity of different groups, to really create these distinct tribes. No, this is this group, this is that group. Yes, they interacted, but they all had their own government, their own culture, their own language. And from what you're saying, it's sort of like you're going back to not lumping them all together, but perhaps talking about how maybe we don't have one Seminole, and obviously the Seminole were an amalgamation of tribes to begin with. So I guess what I'm asking is, are we challenging sort of that more narrative now when we talk about it, and when I continue to talk about it with my students?
Okay, so Dana is moving from 1564 to 1702, and we didn't cover that, and I haven't written that part yet. But I've just finished a big book on the Yamasees, and that covers into really the late 18th century and the emergence of not people who call themselves Seminoles, but who the British and Spanish will call Seminoles. So it's a lot to cover, like that much time, but I'm so excited to hear how engaged you are and how aware you are of Native history, and that's wonderful. And so I'll do my very best in like a couple of minutes to cover all of this. There are a number of ways in which the more narrative is okay. It was British intention to enslave 30 to 50,000, probably more like 50,000 Indigenous people from Florida. And so the more assaults of 1702 here on our region, they assault especially Amelia Island, which is the last kind of stronghold of Guales in the region. They go down and hit the Castillo, can't take the Castillo, and so ultimately give up by late December. Then Moore comes back in 1703 to 1704, but he goes to Appalachia, which is sort of present-day Tallahassee territory. In both of these cases, Moore is not alone. He's operating with other British soldiers and sailors coming from South Carolina. He's also with Indigenous people who have their own agendas. And in a lot of ways, Moore is tacking on British ambitions to really take down the Spanish in Florida to what's already happening among Yamasees, Creeks, Appalachians, Timucuas, and others. So there's this big Indigenous context that is usually erased when Moore is discussed. Moore's intention himself, all alone and with other British soldiers who share that same intention, is to enslave as many Indigenous people as he can. That's how he makes his wealth. It's how he then purchases enslaved African people. He has plantations. He is a slaver, a major slaver, so famous that Daniel Defoe writes about these events and just disparages Moore to no end. And that is really fun to read. Daniel Defoe disparage James Moore. That's a fantastic piece that's easily accessible. So there's a lot more going on. There's a much bigger Indigenous context. I talk a lot about in my new Yamasee book. This is, you've gotten a link from Jennifer Gray to my Yamasee anthology, which is the first time I sort of bring together scholars to talk about the Yamasees. Very little's been written about them. They lived in our region among many other places. I've got a big book that will be coming out in about a year or so on the Yamasees and their full history in Florida and elsewhere. And so I tackle a lot of this there. So in other words, I'm using the old historian standby. It's complicated. I think it's okay to talk about that, but again, to not talk about it as a terminal narrative. So it's not that Moore comes in and wipes out all the remaining Guales and Mocamas, and then the few that survive go and live in St. Augustine. That's not the story that's full and rich and holistic, right? The reality is a lot of Guales have left. For example, over 300 have joined and become Yamasee citizens. A lot of Mocamas have left. We don't really know that story, so I'm going to be digging in a lot to that as I get deeper into that time period, but I'm moving chronologically as historians do in my research. And so I'm in the 1560s right now and not yet in 1702, but I'm not going to end the book at 1702. I can tell you that 100% for sure, because that's not when the Mocama story ends. There is no end to the Mocama story, right? It changes. And so without diminishing the impact of genocidal types of enslavement campaigns, which were horrific, I'm also going to be talking about what scholars call survivance, right? How Mocamas do survive. And we can see, I've seen already glimmers of Mocamas among people who will later be called Seminoles. The Seminoles don't call themselves Seminoles till the 20th century. Before that, as you very astutely described, it's really a label by confused, especially British Anglo settlers who don't understand the really complicated indigenous world of Florida in the 18th and 19th centuries. But again, like I could talk for an hour. It's such good questions. I'm so glad you're teaching, and I want to send my child to your school because I'm very excited to hear everything that you're doing. Someone asked how far west there's evidence of the Timucua, and lots of other people have written about the Timucua. They go basically to just outside of Appalachia. And remember, the Timucua are not one political tribe or nation. They are many, many, many different nations. And so those Western Timucuas are not the same as the Timucuas we're talking about here in our region. They just share a language. They don't share any political alliance. And so there are lots of good scholars, especially Han, who's looked at them, H-A-N-N, John Han. John Worth has a couple of volumes. What you're going to see in those is really good attention to the Timucuas, but you're going to still see a very colonial mindset. You're still going to see them kind of filtering a lot of things through a Spanish lens, especially. So I would encourage you to not take all of their assessments about Timucuas through that lens, but to think about what I've been doing a little bit here today with Keith.
I have a question if we have time for at least one more. So one of the things, and this is for both you and Dr. Ashley, possibly, one of the things that you see in the narrative of Jacksonville history, which has been largely debunked, I believe, but it's still on the Jacksonville Wikipedia site, if you check, is, there was a Timucua village named, is it Ossachite? I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, Ossachite. I have no idea how that would go, but the narrative is that, there was a site somewhere near downtown Jacksonville, which was a Timucua village, and there's even a historical marker there. Can either or both of you talk about sort of like the research behind that, and is that a valid historical supposition, or is it just sort of one of those urban legend things, which is very convenient for people to kind of hang on to?
Yeah, I don't think there's much in the documentation on that at all. I think it's some sort of, urban legend. I'm not sure where its genesis is, but I've been asked about that before, and I don't know anything about it. Maybe Denise does.
Thank God for Wikipedia. So sometimes the sites I'm not going to diss the whole thing. Sometimes the sites are incredible, especially when archaeologists have done them. So a lot of Native South archaeologists who study different archaeological sites throughout the South actually really work on Wikipedia sites. In this case, this is taken from Davis, who in 1925 wrote a history of Jacksonville. He's not a historian. He's part of a genre of local historians who are untrained. I mean, this is also very beginning in the professionalization of history, and who are essentially starting to found historical societies by claiming all of the local history. And one scholar, Jean O'Brien, has looked at this phenomenon in New England. And so actually I taught a course around her book, which looks at the ways in which white colonial settlers claim to be the first of everything. Like we have all the firsts. We have the first St. Patrick's Day celebration. We have the first city. We have the first. So they claim, and Davis is fantastic for this. There's a whole section in his book where it's all the firsts that he's claiming. This is a way to erase indigenous firsts, right? In fact, the first folks to do things here were indigenous for a very, 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 very long time. So he does a lot of this firsting. He also does a lot of what Jean O'Brien calls lasting, like the last of the native people, right? The last of the Mohicans, the last of the Timucuas, right? They're dead and gone, and it's so sad that all native people are going to die. In the late 19th, early 20th century, there was this fiction that circulated in a lot of communities, a lot of white communities, including among anthropologists, that all the native people were about to die out because how could they exist in a modern world? So he fits into that too, this last, like they're not here anymore. And he does also what she calls a replacement narrative, where he replaces indigenous history with white colonial settler history. So now the real history is a white colonial settler history. And Davis has been used recently by local historical societies as a source on Timucuas. So I'm going to tell you that since 1925, we've learned some new things about Timucuas. Right. And so just a little bit, like in the 100 years that have passed, history has become a professional, field. Archaeology has become really professionalized. There's, in fact, right now, so much exciting, cutting edge, new research. And that's why we're writing our book, because we want to fill that gap between all the really cool stuff that archaeologists, historians, and linguists have been doing with our local Indigenous history and the public history, so that Davis is never, ever cited again as a historian. He's not. He's really interesting to look at if you are interested in how whites create narratives about the past that erase and marginalize Indigenous people and other people of color, African Americans and other. He's fascinating for that, but he's not a source of evidence. He's not a source of evidence. He himself is a primary source to be studied in the way that I'm suggesting, but he's not a source for fictional Native communities because he doesn't know anything about them at all, right? It's legends. And again, he has an agenda, which is to present in the 1920s a very white version of Jacksonville's history. And so our book, I would encourage you to read when it comes out. I'm so excited to be writing it. And we really look forward to questions, thoughts, anything you've got.
We had one more in the chat, and then I think after that, we're going to call it a day, if that's all right. There's a question from Haley. Has there been any evidence from the descendants to support the discovery of the shell ring having been dug up? And then she has a question about it hurting the ancestry, which I think means disturbing the descendants.
I'm not sure exactly what she means about that.
I think this goes with, have you reached out to the Seminoles, for example, to ask if archaeological work can be done on the shell ring? And how would the Seminoles today and the TIPO, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and I should say the Seminoles have an unbelievable research team. I mean, it's unparalleled. Like, they put museums to shame, they put archive. I mean, it's just incredible. They're very serious, invested a lot of money, extraordinarily professional, top of the line. So if you were to email the Seminoles and say, hey, we're thinking about doing some archaeology on the shell ring, what would they have to say? They'll say, never dig up ancestors, right? That was another big thing. Never dig up ancestors or burial sites. That is, as you can imagine, is a big no-no. Imagine your great-great-great-grandparents or your church being dug up by someone who's just curious about it without your permission.
So I think there have been shell rings that have been excavated. We've done work into the Grand Shell Ring. Work's been done into the Rollins Shell Ring. So archaeologists have excavated in them. I know that one of the recent interpretations that's come out on the one from St. Catherine's Island in Georgia, they really take a deep indigenous perspective there, and they really mine the indigenous archaeology kind of literature to really do a different type of interpretation. Have these been, I'm not sure how much has been in kind of collaboration with the Seminoles or other groups within the state. The way it kind of works is usually you have to do things by state guidelines unless it applies to indigenous human remains. Once that happens, you do nothing with indigenous remains. So that's always been kind of now for us something we do not do at all. All right. So if I encounter human remains, the first thing I do is I stop. Then I call the state archaeologist. The state archaeologist then calls representatives for the Miccosukee and for the Seminole tribe, and they make the decision on how we proceed. Okay. So really, we can excavate certain sites without really going to the Seminoles, even though ethically it's kind of a good thing to do to let them know. So right now when we talked to the Seminoles recently, we're saying, okay, from now on, we're going to let you know all the projects we do ahead of time, just so you'll know. And I think they like that. They just wanted to be kind of in the loop on things. But one of the first things they said to us, as Denise said, don't dig up our ancestors. That is one of the really major things that they feel strongly about. And I recognize that and I honor that. So we're not out looking to dig into mounds. We don't really want to find any human remains. And if we do, we follow all the proper protocols with regard to indigenous laws as well as legal, U.S. laws or state laws.
Fabulous. Thank you guys so much. All right. I want to thank everyone for attending today. I especially want to thank Dr. Ashley and Dr. Bossy. If everyone can give a clap. I know it's hard sometimes online to do that. This has been a wonderful event. We thank you both so very much for coming, and everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you.